today we're talking about the roots of white supremacy. So we talked about some of the particularities for Native Americans in Oregon last time, and just sort of Native America in general. And one of the reasons I do that, and please don't anyone be offended by this, but we have been, as American people, have been so misled as to who our Native American people are, what we had going here, that we had civilizations, and you know, we didn't, you know, basically didn't contribute anything. We were almost like, you know, half naked, hiding behind trees when the white man arrived and all that kind of stuff. That I have to show you all that stuff, so that even though I know, you know, personally, you know, okay, well, Native people are human beings, but most people don't realize what kind of human beings Native people actually were when white folks arrived, and what we had going. And so I hope that that sort of filled in a lot of that space for you. And I think I mentioned a couple books. Maybe I hope I mentioned 1491 and 1493. Yeah, there's a lot of good books, but and today, as soon as I get into the PowerPoint presentation, I'll mention a couple books that would be good, and so you can be ready to write those down. They're not at the absolute scholarly level, but they're not, you know, 8th grade education either. So they're somewhere in between that. So let me have you, if you're really interested in digging into this and, you know, doing a little bit of study, I'm gonna recommend 4 books that I think will take you through all of ancient history until now. Which these 4 books are really the 4 main books I'm drawing from, you know, that have influenced me, and you know, and so the first one would be a book called A History of White People by Nell Irwin Painter. The second one would be one by a Native guy named Robert Williamson, and he wrote a book called Savage Anxieties. The third one I would suggest is by an African-American woman, a womanist theologian named Kelly Brown Douglas, and she wrote a book called Stand Your Ground. The book, which is my favorite, was sort of encompassed a lot of this, is by my favorite Native author named John Mohawk. And John Mohawk wrote a book called Utopian Legacies. Utopian Legacies. So yeah, so those 4 books will give you some great background. You want to do more study into this, and kind of see what formed my thinking over the years. So MLK said our nation was born in genocide. We tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience to a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. So there were over 800 treaties made between the United States and Indian tribes. And so just two statements about these. Chief Anastosida, Cherokee, said 1777, when we enter treaties with our brothers, the whites, their whole cry is more land. You say, why not the Indians till the ground and live as we do? May we not, with equal propriety, ask, why do not the white people hunt and live as we do? The great God of nature has placed us in different situations. It is true that he has endowed you with many superior advantages, but he has not created us to be your slaves. We are separate people. And then Sitting Bull, who everyone's heard of, said, the white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to distribute it. The love of possessions is a disease with them. They take tithes from the poor and weak to support the rich who rule. They claim this mother of ours, the earth, for their own and fence the neighbors away. So all Indian lands, doesn't matter where you go, were taken through illegal schemes, through fraud, through violence, through force, through bribery, through getting people drunk to sign treaties, through bioterrorism and other dubious means. It began with the Pilgrims from day one, but John Winthrop in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he made a legal declaration annulling any native claims to the land. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land and therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. A natural right did not have legal standing. So I want to tell you a story. So this is a story that comes out of our my particular ancestors' peoples, and I'll sort of make a short version because I don't. It could go for a long ways, but there was a wolf, and that wolf came from Wolf Village, Wolfville, I think they call it, and he was walking down the road one day and he saw a big old terrapin. Now, back in those days, terrapins were way, way bigger than, than they are today. But Wolf saw that terrapin walking down the street, and that terrapin is used to everybody getting out of his way. So the wolf said to him, hey, I'm not going to move out of your way this time. So Terrapin said, well, if you're not going to move out of my way, I'll just kill you. So he did. And he cut that wolf's ears off and he put them around his belt and he walked on. And he was getting hungry by this time. So Terrapin saw a village and it was Wolf Town. And so he went in there and he said, I'm going to stop this village and I'm going to make them give me something to eat. So he goes in there and they were all afraid of Terrapin because he had a terrible reputation and they knew to get out of his way. So he goes in there and he ends up saying, I want some food and I want it now. And so, of course, the wolves all did it. Well, he started eating and he didn't have any silverware, of course. So what he did was he grabbed those 2 wolf ears and he began to use those as spoons and just shovel that food in his mouth. Well, some of the relatives of that wolf that he had killed recognized those ears. And so they set to make a plan. So afterwards, he got sleepy and he went and took over one of their houses and decided to take a nap. Well, the next morning he woke up and there's nobody in the village. So he thought, well, they're all scared of me. So he walked out and all of a sudden they all jumped on him and they tied him up in ropes. And they were trying to decide, now what do we do with him? So Terrapin said, well, whatever you do, don't throw me in a pot and boil me, because that's what they were thinking. Because what I'll do is I'll just slip out of these ropes and, pour the water on the fire and put it out, and then I'll just kill every one of you. So they said, oh yeah, we can't do that. So what could we do? We could just put him over a fire. So Terrapin heard him talking. Terrapin said, well, whatever you do, don't put me over the fire because it's going to burn through these ropes. And then I'm just going to get out and I'm going to kill every one of you. Well, what do? We can't do that. So, well, back in that day, Terrapin was a great swimmer. And so they're out of ideas. And all of a sudden Terrapin says, whatever you do, please don't throw me off the cliff into the river. Terrapin thought he'd just swim away. So they said, oh, he doesn't want us to do that, so let's do it. So they decided to take Terrapin and push him off the cliff. Well, on the way down, Terrapin realized that the water level was really low and he ended up landing on the rocks and he split into about 100 pieces. And as Terrapin's laying there, not able to put himself back together, he all of a sudden develops some humility. And he begins to sing this song. And in this song, he starts singing, Yowa Iwawaji, Yowa Iwawaji. And what he said was, I'm sewing myself together. Creator, I'm sewing myself together. And as he did that, he said it over and over again. And then all of a sudden his parts began to come back, but they didn't get all the parts and he fit a lot smaller. And after Terrapin finally sang himself together and sewed himself together, he was able to crawl off and he walked away with more humility than he ever had before. And of course, the analogy is for Western Europeans and Native Americans, this is a perfect analogy as to how we understand what's been done. And so the hope in this is that there would become an epidemic of humility among the Western thinkers, in the way that they treat other people. And I have down here, only when we realize we were broken and fragmented and set on our own destruction and the destruction of the next 7 generations can we sing ourselves back together and heal to have real freedom. And what we try to do is help people see from a different worldview. So I made up a word, and I probably won't ever be famous, but if I was ever to be famous for anything, I would want it to be for a word I made up. And the word is Indigeno-Latfricasiana. Because this has been being talked about for so long. The increasing importance and influence of indigenous Latin American, African, Asian, and Oceanic peoples and peoples from these ethnicities in the declining Euro-American Western dominated world and worldview. So I decided I'm going to come up with a word for this to describe it instead of having to use all these different. So my word is Indigeno-Latfricasiana. So let's look at people of color in America. In 2008, more than 1/3 of the people of the United States were peoples of color, are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from ethnic minorities. In 2013, over half of all the children born in the United States were Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and this will continue to increase. In 2014, over half of all the school children were BIPOC. In 2042, over 50% of the people in the United States will be BIPOC, which means there will be no majority at that time. And the white population will continue to decline and eventually become the most recognizable and fastest declining minority in the United States. And we've seen what happens, though, when Western European white folks are the minority, but continue to hold all the power. And if you want to think about what that's like, think of apartheid South Africa, because that could be what our future looks like. So let's look at where Christianity fits in. In 1900, historically, traditionally white nations comprised 83% of all Christians in the world. In 2005, they comprised only 40% of all Christians in the world. In 2050, they will comprise 29% of all the Christians in the world. And white Christian majority in most of those nations will only continue to diminish. So you can see here, and of course, you know, Portland has been always known as the nun zone, right? So, but here's up to a 2014 study that between 2007, 2014, Christian share of the population fell from 78.4 to 70.6, driven mainly by declines among mainline Protestants and Catholics. The unaffiliated experienced the most growth, and the share of Americans who belong to non-Christian faiths also increased. You can kind of see what's happened here. And so what I wanted to bring up is some of what I think is a good apples to apples comparison between indigenous worldview and the worldview of Western Europeans. And we're all affected by this, by the way. Everybody, if you live in the United States, you are saturated daily with a Western worldview. But I'm not going to go through all these, but I am going to go through a few of the things on this list next. But if you just want to take a quick look and compare and see some differences in characteristics of a Western European United States worldview and indigenous worldviews. Okay, now let's look at a couple of these. So what I say, the besetting sin of the Western worldview is dualism. So, and that's inherited, of course, it's Platonic dualism. It's inherited all the way back, you know, from the Greeks. This idea that the physical and mental are two separate worlds, two separate aspects of who we are, and can be separated, resulting in no certain reality, abstract reality. So in other words, there's more emphasis on the ethereal than the material, more on the abstract than the concrete. And so that makes, you know, our bodies suspect. It makes the world suspect. But what it does is it highlights all the mind, the spirit, if you will, and all the products of the mind. So all the things that, you know, that mean so much to us, like, you know, covenants and the Bible and constitutions and those kinds of things. Also morally dualistic, which is a unique aspect, I think, and even the English language, I think, is oriented to this. We see it, if you watch politics, you see it every single day. People they go to binary choices constantly. And you sit there and think, come on, people, can't you get away from binary choices? But, we're made to think that way. Things are either right or wrong, legal, illegal, heaven or hell, sin or righteousness, success or failure, civilized or primitive, introvert, extrovert, saved or lost, clean, dirty. Some things are weeds, some things are plants, some things are animals, some things are varmints. We have these classifications, these binary classifications for everything. Another aspect of the Western worldview is extrinsically categorical. So there, this reductionism that can divide and classify life with little attention to the whole. So the problem, I actually think this is a very positive part of the Western worldview, to be able to break down and categorize things ad infinitum. The problem is that we don't understand the relationship of those categories to the whole being, to the whole person, to the whole picture. And we begin to live out of those categories as if they are reality, rather than understanding the whole is reality. One easy illustration of this is, I have a podiatrist, I have a cardiologist, I have a neurologist, I have a general practitioner, I have a ear, nose, and throat, ENT. If each one treats me like I'm just that thing without regard for all the rest, I could end up in a lot of trouble. And unfortunately, sometimes that's how medicine works. So, but we do that with education, we do it with economics, we do it with all kinds of things. We don't understand that we are made to be thinking in wholeness, not these extrinsic categories. Hierarchy. Once you go down the dualistic road and you place spirit or mind over body and the physical, everything has to line up hierarchical. So now you have human beings over nature, you have men over women, you have whites over other folks, you name it, and there's, everybody sort of knows where they fit in, right? And so the idea is that equality is somehow wrong. Hierarchies, right, resulting in structured dehumanization by class, race, gender, religion, etc. So, and I don't, just looking at the life of Jesus, I don't see that at all. I see, don't lord over each other like the Gentiles, instead, serve one another. And we think of that as a, sort of an ethic or, a value, but I think it also, by example, was, in terms of governance, like the more input, the better, I think. Utopianism. Utopia is a central shared myth or vision of Euro-American culture as being the perfect form of human existence, future-oriented, any problem can be solved. Always an emphasis on something that's going to happen in the future, right? White supremacy, which is, within the hierarchies, that ultimately white people deserve control of all the knowledge, all the wealth, all the power. And you maintain that through white normalcy and white privilege. And white normalcy is really I think the biggest culprit that we miss. We like to focus on white privilege, but we don't talk a lot about white normalcy. It's, white normal is becoming less and less the norm, but more and more people are violently saying, no, we don't want to lose that normalcy. And the insurrection over the Capitol on January 6th is a perfect example of that. Anthropocentric. Human beings are viewed apart from creation and should rule over creation instead of understanding themselves as a part of creation and each being related to the other. Triumphalistic, break the soil, harness nature, conquer the mountain. I always think it's hilarious when they're they conquered El Capitan. And I'm like, you conquered it. Wait a minute, it was there. You climbed it. It's still there, and it's going to be there long after you are gone, but you conquered the mountain. That's an interesting way of putting it. In a also in a state of constant war over control of wealth, right? Self-seeking cooperativeness is necessary but limited. Competition's more the norm. Sharing's done from abundance and not as a value. Patriarchal dehumanization of women through lower pay, social roles, sexual exploitive or rape culture, all of that. So all of these are some of the negative aspects of a Western European worldview that we have inherited over these years. So what happens with that in mind, so they were warming up, you know, for almost 3,000 years with the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then, you know, the English, really is where Anglo-Saxonism really gets going. And all of this, you know, the Greeks had their, you know, their barbarians, and the Romans had their savages, and, you know, the English had their heathens. And in the United States, you know, we've had everything: Native Americans, Black folks, you know, homosexuals, you know, women, especially strong-willed women, you know, all of these basically to warm up, as the warm up. And in 1452, Nicholas V issues to King Alfonso V of Portugal a papal bull, directed the king to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ. And of course, this is one of the last crusades, right? To put them in the perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property. And in 1492, Columbus is discovered in the Caribbean, I like to say. So just 40 years later. So this is where Columbus is coming out of, this Europe that's inundated with this kind of thinking for Christians. 1493, the Antikythera, which was another papal bull to subjugate the discovered people and bring them to faith, to propagate the Christian empire, gave half the globe to Portugal and the other half to Spain. And of course, 1493 is an interesting date, right? That's when you hear from God. You get this papal bull that's a revelation, because in 1492, you find out there's a whole nother world out there. So Bartolome de las Casas, some of you have probably heard of him. He was sort of the human rights guy for natives in this country. He actually went back to Europe and charged Columbus with genocide, and Columbus was not found guilty. But and his numbers here, just so you know, are not correct, but you know, they're not that far off either. He says, as for the vast mainland, which is 10 times larger than all Spain, we're sure that our Spaniards, with their cruel and abominable acts, have devastated the land and exterminated the rational people who fully inhabited it. We can estimate very surely and truthfully that in 40 years that have passed, with the infernal actions of the Christians, there have been unjustly slain more than 12 million men, women, and children. In truth, I believe, without trying to deceive myself, that number of slain is more like 15 million. So it probably wasn't that many, but it was in the millions. And it was cruel, you know, heinous acts, barbarous acts that were inflicted because they weren't considered human beings. And so it wipes out basically almost the whole Taino population and the Caribe population down in the, what we call the West Indies now. And we're really thankful that De las Casas recorded all this stuff. And Columbus's journals tell a lot too, but the thing about De las Casas is that we forget, like, he was like one of our liberal friends, right? But he never questioned the right to subjugate them. He only questioned that it be done with kindness. So, you know, so, I mean, yeah, so subjugated in kindness is better than subjugated with cruelty. But, you know, hey, how about, like, what gives you the right to even do this? So in 1823, this becomes codified in law in a case called Johnson versus McIntosh. It went to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall said Christian European nations assumed ultimate dominion over lands in America during the Age of Discovery. So what had happened was that one guy, and I can't remember if it was Johnson or McIntosh, but one of them was given land for his service in the war against Great Britain in the United States. He was given a land grant. Well, part of that land was already inhabited by someone who had purchased it from a chief and an Indian chief. And so they went to court. So two white guys go to court about this. And basically they said that the Indians didn't have the right to do it because it wasn't their land, because of the Doctrine of Discovery, right? And upon the Doctrine of Discovery, the Indians lost their rights to complete sovereignty, to retain only a right of occupancy. So very similar to what, and then he said in 1776, the United States became the successor nation to the right of discovery. So, and acquired power from the Dominion from Great Britain, since they had won it from Great Britain. And now it becomes the cornerstone of U.S. Indian policy and property law today. So Johnson versus McIntosh is always cited as the case against Native Americans. You can't really win against that. In 1831, it's used again. Marshall ruled against the principle of discovery and extends it. The Cherokee Nation not being fully sovereign and being a domestic dependent nation, which is still what the classification is today. Treaties made with sovereign Indian nations are the supreme law of the land. Anything, I told you that over 800 were made and none kept, right? Supreme law of the land, and anything in the Constitution notwithstanding. Now subject to legislative authority, the U.S. government has plenary power. So this just gave another stroke of power to the United States over Native people. So this becomes now federal law, and remember, this is a Christian doctrine. It comes out of the church. And the funny thing is that even though it was Roman Catholic bulls, the Protestants began to use it also and plant their flags everywhere and claim it. So this is really a ecumenical document or doctrine, if you will. So because of this, in 1835, Indian Removal Act begins to happen. 50,000 Indians were moved east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory or Oklahoma. In 1887, because of these laws, the General Allotment Act, Indians lost 90 million acres of land. The Black Hills were taken from the Sioux, which is a violation of a 1868 treaty. But the U.S. still continues not to honor those. Now let's get up to the present day. In 2005, the city of Sherrill, New York, versus the Oneida Nation. And the Oneida begins, they got casinos, right? Well, don't let Indians get money because they're going to put it into land, right? So they start buying back all these houses and places that are up for sale, and pretty soon they've purchased a whole bunch of land, and now they're claiming it as part of their own sovereign nation because it was theirs originally, right? So so they purchased all this within their original reservation boundaries, and they said that now we're immune from local property taxes. Well, it was rejected by the United States Supreme Court and cited from because of the Doctrine of Discovery. And here's it said that the tribe was precluded from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. And that opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Not to speak ill of the dead, but I just want to say, this is not really a Democratic or a Republican, but it's just an American doctrine. For more than 5 centuries, the Doctrine of Discovery and international laws based upon it have legalized, because the same thing happened in Australia, New Zealand, and all these other places, by the way. International laws based upon it have legalized the theft of land and legalized labor, free labor, and resources from indigenous peoples across the world, and systematically denied their human rights. The Doctrine of Discovery originated with the Christian church and was based on Christian scripture, including the Great Commission, the divine mandate to rule based on Romans 13, and the narrative of covenantal people justified in taking possession of the land as described in the Exodus story, the Joshua narrative, as we like to call it. So one of my professors, and I wrote the foreword to this book, said it well. I think he said, you know, because people always ask me, why didn't I learn this in school? Why didn't I learn this stuff? So in his book, Jesus and Pocahontas, Gospel Mission and National Myth, Howard Snyder said this: Pocahontas portrayals tell the saga of Indian-white relations. At first, the Indians are hostile and dangerous, but key figures like Pocahontas bring reconciliation. Eventually, the Indians are subdued and, according to the myth, integrated into a new nation. From the first, two options loom for the Indians: peaceful integration on the white man's terms, symbolized by Pocahontas' marriage and baptism, or forced submission, marginalization, and annihilation. Pocahontas actually speaks of the stealing of native lands and the genocide of native peoples, America's original sin. Though well-known and fully documented, its moral meaning has never been faced. The scattered, impoverished Indian nations in the U.S. and in the underclass of Native Americans in many large U.S. cities remain to bear witness. So all white folks didn't think the same. So I think it's real important to say that. But the majority were, you know, just like we've got some crazy majorities happening now in different places. The majority of people were for Western expansion, right? The people on the East, interesting enough, often were the defenders of Indians, but, you know, I mean, they had moved the Indians out 100 years before. So, but you had people like Ben Franklin, you had people like William Penn, you had people like, you know, Thoreau and Emerson. So here's a couple quotes. In Civil Disobedience, Thoreau rhetorically inquired, how does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace and be associated with it. So they're sort of like looking for truth and found it, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson prophetically warned, the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as a man swallows arsenic, which brings him down. In turn, Mexico will poison us. So all of this, there was a cost to all of this. And you know, I actually think that we are paying the cost right now in our political environment to this myth. The American myth problematizes the other, right? Like it's their problem. So it's Native Americans' problem for, you know, rejecting our own colonization. It's and these words have been used throughout. The Indian problem. Has a central motif or meta-narrative. It universalizes its meta-narrative through history, theology, economic systems, the family, etc. It subordinates anything contrary to the myth, and those who differ are traitors or unpatriotic, etc. So like Native Americans, we could be terrorists, which we were once, noble savages or mascots, but never fully and equally human in the American myth. So American religion promises, according to the Western mind, the future hope of salvation, development, security, civilization, equality, freedom, prosperity. But what it has delivered to indigenous peoples is imbalance, oppression, violence, and destruction. Christian mission was always used as a colonizing strategy. Here's a couple extreme examples, but you need to know that they're there. 1637, there's a massacre of a friendly Pequot village, described by William Bradford. He said, those that escaped the fire were, well, by the way, he walks up, this group walks up, and Cotton Mather and a bunch of other folks. And the friendly Indian village of the Pequots, the chief walks out and says, good cheer, gentlemen. In other words, you know, hey, hi, how are you? And they commence to kill them. It says that those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewn to pieces, others run through with rapiers. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands. So a lot of these ideas of civilization are, were couched in Christian religion. Colonization begins with religion. This is a friend of mine who said this, specifically with a theology that serves to raise the colonizers above those to be colonized. Such theologies of conquest are most usually based on exclusive truth claims and exclusive notions of salvation. The idea that every nation since the dawn of creation has been itching to overthrow its neighbors and set up dominion as a colonizing empire is proved false through the archaeological record. However, when a people develop the idea that they have exclusive possession of communication from God and exclusive control of the means of salvation, all the peoples of the earth stand in peril. Here's Cotton Mather in his book, The Magnificent Christ of America, commenting on the genocide of the Pequot. In a little more than an hour, 500 or 600 of those barbarians were dismissed from a world that was burdened with them. It may be demanded, should not Christians have more mercy and compassion? But sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. We had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings. A couple thoughts from a couple thinkers. Blaise Pascal said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. And Ben Franklin, in a letter to his father, said, I think vital religion has always suffered when orthodoxy is more regarded than virtue. The scriptures assure me that at the last day, we shall not be examined on what we thought, but what we did. And then a fellow I've read, Eric Hoffer, 1957, who had thoughts on the nature of mass movements. I thought this was the True Believer. The book's called, I don't know if anyone's ever read that, but a couple quotes that are really germane to today. He said, all mass movements, which is what these were, right? Even in the early colony days, these were mobs. All mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for united action, all of them, irrespective of the doctrine. They preach and they program, they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful flow and activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and a single-hearted allegiance. And then this one is really good. Members of a fanatic group are taught to have a common hatred, a single foe, a devil. The ideal devil is a foreigner. Hitler, the foremost authority on devils, found it easy to brand German Jews as foreigners. So I've heard somebody requote this and say, any mass movement can exist without God, but no mass movement can exist without a devil. So this mythical norm that some of us are trying to distance ourselves from, and some of us are trying to reinforce right now in our country. Audre Lorde put it well. She said, somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there is what I call a mythical norm. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. It's with this mythical norm that the trappings of power reside within this society. The Doctrine of Discovery has been severely condemned as socially unjust, racist, and in violation of basic and fundamental human rights. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues noted Discovery Doctrine as the foundation of the violation of human rights for Indigenous people. And in 2012 called for a mechanism to investigate historical land claims. Of course, when they began to call for this, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand were the 4 countries who rejected it. Eventually, they accepted it. John Kennedy said in 1961, our treatment of Indians still affects the national conscience. It seems a basic requirement to study the history of our Indian people. Only through this study can we as a nation do what must be done. If our treatment of the American Indian is not to be marked down for all time as a national disgrace. And I like this one by William Penn. He was talking to the Delaware chief who he was negotiating land with. He said, my friends, there's a great God and power that hath made the world and all the things therein, to whom you and I and all the people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one day give account for all that we do in the world. This great God hath written his law in our hearts, by which we are taught and commanded to love and to help and do good to one another. Now this great God hath been pleased to make me concerned in your part of the world, but I desire to enjoy it with your love and consent. that we may always live together as neighbors and friends. Else what would the great God do to us, who hath made us not to devour and destroy one another, but to live soberly and kindly together in the world? So I just wanted to mention, you probably, none of you know my story. This picture on the left is original Cherokee territories. This is Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, I'm sorry, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Northern Georgia, Northern Alabama. All of that was original Cherokee territory. And then this picture right below it here of the old village is actually one of my ancestors, my third great grandfather's village site. I think I might have mentioned that last week, but and then this is my wife and I are in front of Elahe Village for Indigenous Leadership and Ministry Development. This was our home. This is us, my wife playing in the creek with the kids, and those are three of my four kids. So we had purchased 50 acres after years and years to create this community, school, farm, basically everything we're doing again now. And we had a number of people living there. We had native elders who lived there and sort of were our elders in residence. So we had, I think we had 12 different people or families living there on this 50 acres. And our schools were such a success. We were having these Thursday through Sunday schools, and they were such a success that we were having like 30, 40 people over these extended weekends. About half were native, and then half of the other half work with native people. So it was influential. We would have ceremony and teaching, and just people get their hands in the ground and other things like this. But yeah, so we were needing to build some more places so people could sleep, because they were sleeping in their cars and in tents and on our couches, and we'd already built the garage and the dormer over the garage into bunkhouses, and still didn't have enough room. So on the last night of the final approval of the building sites and everything, about 50 of my neighbors showed up. I'll make this short, but and they just, one right after another, I guess they've been planning this for a long time, objected to us doing what was legal for us to do, was to continue our school. And they had all kinds of crazy reasons, like Indians are alcoholics and they're going to wander on our property and get hurt and sue us for everything we have. And, who's going to protect our children from these people, and, all this kind of crazy stuff. But what happened was, a couple days later, one of the neighbors, who was from a paramilitary white supremacist group, their group set up a 50 caliber machine gun on our property line and began to fire that at all times, day and night, to threaten us. But we first thought they were trying to kill us, right? 50 caliber is a big bullet. Kids couldn't play by the windows, couldn't go outside. And county sheriff wouldn't do anything about it. Justice Department wouldn't do anything about it. State's Attorney General wouldn't do anything about it. Fair Housing said it's not under their bailiwick. And we had no choice but to eventually, everything we built up there over the years, to sell. And it was during the economic downturn, and so we only sold it for half the appraised value, because we'd already refinanced twice, and we were going to end up losing it if we didn't sell it for half of what it was worth. So that set us on about a 10-year debt cycle and problem, and through our organization into a spin, we're finally at the point where we're recovering. But that was, basically we were chased out by white supremacists. And people think, well, does that still happen today? Yeah, happened to me. And it happens to other folks. Here's one of our schools, people around the camp, or a fire here in the top right. Here's our sweat lodge over here. This is my friend Richard Twist and myself on the drum, my son dancing, my wife, and we're welcoming all the foreign students at the school to this Cherokee homeland, and having a big goat roast and things like that. So these are the kinds of signs that some of our towns in Oregon, had sundown towns. Everybody's familiar with those, right? James Lowen wrote a book called Sundown Towns. These are from Washington and Oregon. So the largest Klan meeting ever held in the Northwest was held in Enumclaw, Washington, not too far north from us. And the Sunday meeting was preached. The pastor or the preacher that day at that Ku Klux Klan major mega rally was none other than Billy Sunday, if you've ever heard of him. You know all about, because you've studied Black history and Black racism in Oregon, you understand, how it's the Klan and all that has infiltrated for so long. But one of the things that people are beginning to draw attention to now is the death of Narcissa Whitman, who was the first missionary woman killed here. This very paternalistic mission, and the people, they basically set up a store on the Oregon Trail, and the Cayuse people weren't being given all these things, but they saw them making money, so it was kind of they were upset already. But the Cayuse people also then, because of the travelers, ended up getting smallpox, and a lot of them dying, and so they went in and they killed Narcissa Whitman. Over the years, there's all these studies have been done how she was turned into basically the angel here in the whole Manifest Destiny scheme. She becomes a blonde, beautiful, innocent angel, calling people to the West because of her martyrdom. It's a really interesting study. So over 500 years of white male supremacy normalizes this myth, right? Forced removal of the genocide and ethnocide of Native Americans, Native American and Black chattel slavery. Native Americans were slaves for almost 100 years before Black folks were imported from West Africa. Laws operating during Jim Crow era, residual racism in the 20th and 21st centuries, residential boarding schools, which if you don't know about, I'm not going to take the time, but it's basically really probably the greatest shame in this country's history is forcing Native children into these work camps that were called boarding schools. And they were often physically abused. They died from starvation. They were sexually abused tremendously. And it's become sort of the what we're still dealing with in Native communities now because of this. Chamawa Indian School was one of those down in Salem. Cult of domesticity, denying women's rights, mascots, caricatures, cartoons, colloquialisms, political dog whistles. And now the dog whistles are gone, and I'm quoting Shakespeare here. Cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war. It's just sort of all out game now. So interesting pictures from Birmingham, 1963, when the dogs were let loose on Black folks. And then the same thing happened at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in 2016. They also took our elders. They threw off their eagle feather headdresses on the ground, arrested them, which the eagle feather hit the ground is sort of it's a taboo in Native culture. They put them in dog cages and put numbers to identify them on their wrists, they knew what they're doing. So we can talk about this. What kinds of questions do you have? Or comments, please. I certainly don't know everything, but it'd be helpful to hear from other people and what you're thinking.
Your discussion of I had to write it down. Any mass movement can exist without a God, but no mass movement can exist without a devil. A profound insight there, I think. And I'm just thinking about the attack on the Capitol building and the way in which people are being demonized, literally, as we speak, in that horrible Q business.
It doesn't look like it's getting any better. It looks like it's actually getting worse.
So I taught at St. Lubre Indian School on the Cheyenne Reservation in eastern Montana, and still have many friends there. And that school goes back over 100 years. It's a Roman Catholic mission. It has a terrible history. I mean, of course, in recent generations, I mean, the children are being treated well, and there's lots of benefits to children attending there. But you know, it had all those horrible, horrible things about the residential schools in terms of, you know, denying culture and the children being hurt and brutalized by the nuns and the priests. And there was, in recent years, a huge sexual abuse lawsuit against some of the former Roman Catholic clergy.
Most of the major denominations were involved in those. And the Anglican Church of Canada had the most, because the same thing happened in Canada as the United States. The difference in Canada, the denominations ran the schools, and then the government partnered with them. In the United States, the government ran the schools and the denominations partnered with them, but the results are all the same. Widespread, terrible cultural abuse, child enslavement, lots of sexual abuse of every kind, brutalization, torture, and I have stories about all these things. I've heard from elders in Canada and the U.S., and they were all alike. Basically, you get the same stories out of the different schools wherever you go. My father-in-law is a survivor, or was a survivor of residential Indian boarding school. He was the oldest of 4 kids, and when he was 11, they came and told his parents that the Indian agents and said that that the oldest sons had to go, and if you didn't send the oldest sons, they would take all the children. So he had to go in place of, so they wouldn't take his 3 younger siblings. And he was there from 11 to 17, and horrendous things he had to go through, torture, and which I know leads to a lot of the alcoholism and suicides in the Indian communities, is because it continues to reverberate through generations.
So first of all, thank you, Randy, for being with us and sharing this knowledge with us, and just the it's a lot to take in, and I feel kind of disheartened and troubled by this. Obviously, it's a kind of a brutal legacy to inherit. So first of all, thanks for being here, and even though it might mean it's just kind of I feel terrible and apologetic about our legacy, but having said that, I'm doing the sacred ground that some people on this in this forum are in the process of taking, and if you haven't, then I certainly recommend that. That's through the Episcopal Church, and Bishop Curry is leading that. But I'm on the last session, and you talked about the boarding schools for Native Americans that they were forced to go to. And there's a documentary called Dawnland, Dawnland, that had to do with the Wapanaki tribe in Maine, and they're the people of the light, or the first dawn, because they're on the East Coast and they're indigenous. And but they talked about the history of forced separation from the children from the parents and family of the different tribes in Maine. So even after the boarding school, this was going on through like the government agencies like foster care and child welfare were removing Native American children from their families. And which is a more recent terrible legacy that the U.S. government is responsible for. But one of the things I wanted to bring up besides that documentary, Dawnland, is that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission based off of the experiences of the Native people in Maine, the Wabanaki, Confederated people. And there were multiple tribe leaders, I think 4 of them, along with the governor of Maine, that opened up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people could share their experiences, and it was very powerful. And I just wanted to make people aware of that. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend that.
Yeah. In Canada, of course, Canada had a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well, and across the whole nation. And they're still trying to figure out what's the best way to resolve that. The foster care system is a problem. They take Native children out at probably twice the rate that they do anybody else. If anyone here works or knows anyone who works in the foster care system in Portland, the Native children actually are the largest percentage in foster care. And they're not by any means the largest percentage by population. So there's still some crazy things going on.
Okay, anybody else?
So, Randy, I don't often go to casinos, but I'm wondering in Oregon or maybe also Washington, the long-term benefit of Indian-owned casinos, and specifically maybe for sponsoring for college or other programs.
Yeah. So the casinos are basically, they're not really Native values. I mean, they don't really enforce Native values. I think most Native tribes see them as a short-term goal to a more long-term things. But and there's some tribes who still, even though they have the right, they won't, like the Hopi tribe, for example, they just say it's not in our Hopi values to you take advantage of people's problems. And so they don't do casinos, they do strip malls instead in Hopi land. But yeah, so tribes like the Grand Round, for example, Spirit Mountain, which is the #1 tourist attraction in Oregon. It used to be Multnomah Falls. That stopped a number of years ago. Spirit Mountain brings in a whole lot of money for the Grand Round, and they do all kinds of incredible things with their money. Education, culture education, lots of other things, college scholarships, all those kinds of things. So a lot of tribes do well. There's only about 11% of all tribes that have casinos. People don't realize that. And then a smaller percentage that actually make profit on them. So it's not as easy as everybody thinks, but some have done well, like Grand Round, like the Flathead Reservation, the 3 tribes there on the Flathead have done well. There's other ones that are, I don't know how this Alene is doing up there, but if they're run well, you can make money and you can use them for good purposes. And what can you say? Like I think the Palm Spring tribe was one of the poorest in the United States and now are the wealthiest. They went from living in, sort of cardboard shacks to everybody driving a Hummer, So it's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah. Some people just call it reparations.
Anyway, I listened to Wilbur Slockish, wonderful guy. He's been so active and he's still, he was born in 1944. He's still going strong. And he, just listening to him was a very moving, inspiring, and powerful.
That's good. Yeah, we're very concerned about the earth. I'll mention more. I haven't mentioned anything about ecology or creation, but we're going to talk next week. Our final week will be, I think we're calling it consequences and repair. So we're going to talk about some of the maybe unknown consequences of the Western worldview and white supremacy. And creation is one of them, of course. Ecological damage, and then also sort of like, well, okay, well, I get all this. I understand I'm affected by the Western worldview. I'm white, Western European, you know, United Statesian. And so what do I do besides sort of continue to get educated? So I've got a sort of a whole bunch of suggestions that would be germane. So hopefully people will tune in next week and we can find out how to start making change as well. So.
Randy, I wanted to thank you for the information about Cotton Mather. I was realizing how little I know about Cotton Mather. And so I've been peeking at Wikipedia while we've been talking. And what I notice is that there's a lot here about his participation in the Salem witch trials, which apparently he inspired. Almost nothing at all about his attacks on Native populations. So I want to thank you for bringing that to our attention.
He's considered the premier theologian of the Puritans, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that says a whole lot about our foundations, you know? So.
Jeff.
So I see Randy's backdrop is an impressive collection of books. And I remember last week he had those two nice guitars in the background. And during this past week, I was able to watch a documentary. And if you're a fan of music, there's a documentary, I think it was done in 2017, and it's called Rumble.
Yes.
And it's the Indians Who Rock the World. And it talks about a lot of very notable artists, music artists, who some of us know had some Native American, if not full Native American, at least partial.
Yeah, it's incredible. I love it. When we do Indigenous spirituality, I have everybody watch that. It's actually free on one of the, I think it might be Amazon, but I'm not sure. But yeah, it's a really well made documentary, and it shows the not just influence, but almost some of the original pioneers. I guess that's a weird word to use with Native folks, but trailblazers in the different genres of music that we all enjoy today. So I think it will surprise and delight you if you watch that. I'd recommend that to everybody.
It's streaming on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
I have a question, unless somebody else has a question. Okay, so a few years ago, there was an artist who was featured at Trinity. His first name was Mark. Maybe Liz will remember his last name, a Native man who I'd also seen at a fundraiser for the Red Lodge Transition Project. But there was a woman who Mark and this woman who was a chief of her tribe, they came to talk to us. I believe they were Chinook. Is that right, Liz? Anyway, they were trying to become recognized as a tribe, but they weren't able to achieve tribal status. So I'm wondering, at that time, they weren't able to do it, but I was wondering, what does it take to be a federally recognized tribe? Like, what did you?
So one of the tribes that there's actually a documentary out about this as well, but the Duwamish people are one of the ones in that documentary who were one of the tribes that received recognition by Clinton and then were taken away by Bush. So here's the irony of the whole thing. You're a federally recognized tribe if the United States had to deal with you to get something from you. So if they wanted something from you, like land, then they had to recognize you as a federally recognized tribe. A lot of the minor tribes and other groups who were just sort of cast aside during those times, and they're not recognized. So there are more non-federally recognized tribes today than there are federally recognized tribes. I think there's 570 something now.
Okay.
Federally recognized tribes. It's ironic because the federally recognized people are the ones we call the real Indians, or at least most people call the real Indians. And but their recognition is from the colonial government. And this whole thing is it's very complex how it works. Some groups are state recognized, some groups are just clubs, so to speak, who've kept their traditions. I know a group in the mountains of Eagle Mountain in near Chattanooga who've kept their traditions and things for, they're all mixed married white folks, and most of them are very European looking, but a lot of them still speak their language. They still hold their ceremonies and things. They've been doing this for, I don't know, 170 years or so. So it's strange, and it's, yeah. And so to become a federally recognized tribe, you have to, if you're not recognized already, you have to have had a government in place and a land base in continuously since invasion, basically. So it's very difficult to do. And yeah, the whole thing is just totally messed up. And so the question of who is Indian is always a big question. And of course, the people who are federally recognized say, well, we're the only real Indians. And yet I know people who are basically, who look full blood, who are parts of groups that aren't recognized at all, who are obviously Native. And so, yeah, it's just it's a crazy system. And it's crazy deliberately, just like Indian law is the most bureaucratic and beleaguered system that you can imagine. And that goes also for the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Department of Interior. So they're made to be this way so that nothing can ever get done, and Indians eventually just assimilate into Western society.
It sounds complicated, and it sounded like this group was getting some pushback from some other tribes, some resistance.
And there's a lot of jealousy. Some people are in the same area. They don't want to share like block grants and the same, that only go to certain regions. And yeah, so it's a mess.
Well, it's kind of like when I lived in Philadelphia, and there was the Irish neighborhood and the Italian neighborhood and the Ukrainians, and nobody wanted to cross each other's territory, But
unfortunately.
yeah.
Randy, I got a question about, as far as, have there been any studies recently as far as the percentage of Native Americans who had the access to vote and who participated in elections?
Yeah, that's a really good question. More this election than ever. Native folks generally turn out Democratic, except for in states like Oklahoma, which are very red states. Then especially in eastern Oklahoma, they tend to vote sort of with the more conservative folks. But generally, most places, Native people haven't been politically active. Obama, a lot of people don't know this. Obama went to a lot of small reservations and spoke in places like my wife's reservation, and spoke in Ethity, Wyoming, in a gym that probably only holds 400 people. So a lot of people started getting more politically active under the Obama election. And now pretty much most Indians hate Trump. And so they've come out to vote against him. And it looks like even places like the Navajos in Arizona helped to deliver Biden in Arizona. So, yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Kathleen Bruner about whether you have more information about voter suppression in the reservations.
Yeah, so because the reservations are pretty, they run their own show, so to speak. It's not the same as in, like urban areas where council people and others are able to take out voting machines or mayors and people like that. So I'm sure there's probably some that goes on in places like Eastern Oklahoma and more conservative places, but I don't think so. I don't. The Indian vote has almost been a joke up until the last several elections, right? So we weren't people with any influence, so no one ever came out. I think Kennedy was the last one to come out to the reservations and spend time. But now, as you know, we have 2 Native American Congress people. I think there's been more elected in this last session, last election. We have now one of our people, Deb Holland, which you guys mentioned last time, is now the head of the Secretary of the Interior, which is a big thing. So, and this is basically what the ramifications of what I was saying earlier in the PowerPoint presentation is that as more Native people become educated and get places of influence, just like in Africa, African American and Latinx and all other minority peoples become more prominent, their voices get heard a lot more and they have more influence, they write more things, people start to hear a different history than what they've been taught. And some people like you good folks are like, oh, this is important to know. And other folks are like, you're lying. That's not the history that this country was built on, and we'll kill you if you keep saying it. So,
Yeah.
Right. Real quick, are you familiar with the Indigenous people's history of the United States?
Yeah, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book.
Yeah.
That's a great little book. Yeah.
Well, that's just really hard for some. I think some people would have a hard time agreeing with it because it especially in the first 4 chapters, it goes into all the atrocities that were committed against the tribes.
Yeah.
And none of that was ever. We never were taught that in our history classes, in high school or elementary school. And
yeah,
it's just wonderful to be able to have that, see things from the Native people's perspective as far as how they were treated. And but anyway, I haven't read it all the way through, just starting on it.
Yeah, it's good. Remember back in the early 70s, Dee Brown wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And that was it served the same purpose for that generation. And now Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has written, I think, something much better even now to serve that purpose, to sort of educate people as like here's the history you don't know about, right?
So it's 8:30 and I'm going to wrap things up for us tonight. I'd really like to thank you, Randy. I feel like there's so much to learn, and it's a complicated history, but it is a sad history in many ways, but also resilient. I always think of Native people as very resilient. So
one of the famous calls throughout Indian country, I mean, if nothing else can be said, it's like, we're still here, right?
Well, I'm looking forward to next week, and thank you, everyone. It's so good to see everybody here.
All right, we'll see y'all next week.